For this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is, how did the Civil War affect the domestic slave trade? Our guest, Robert Colby, is an assistant professor of history at the University of Mississippi after teaching at the Center for American Studies at Christopher Newport University. He has published in numerous academic journals and has won numerous prizes. His first book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South, is the topic of today's discussion. He's a friend of BRI and has participated in numerous teacher programs presenting lectures there. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks in the American Civil War series. Robert, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Great. And, I really loved An Unholy Traffic. It's really a great book. We learn. I personally knew, a good amount about the domestic slave trade, in the antebellum period, but, I didn't know as much about this period of the Civil War and the effects it might have had on it, and made a lot of facile assumptions that it would have just completely broken it down and slaveholders would have been, getting rid of their enslaved persons and selling them. But you really tell a very complex picture, and I can't wait to dive in and hear more.
I think I look forward to it.
Great. All right, so helping to set the scene a little bit, can you explain to our audience sort of the character, the contours, the importance of the domestic slave trade before the Civil War?
Well, sure. And the domestic slave trade, by which we mean the movement of large numbers of enslaved people from generally the upper South, places like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, to the lower South, particularly the Mississippi River Valley, but also the plantation regions of Alabama, Georgia, and by the time of the Civil War, the Trans-Mississippi West, particularly Arkansas and Texas. The domestic slave trade acts on a pretty simple principle, which is that in the lower South regions, particularly those where people can grow cotton and sugar, the labor of enslaved people is simply worth more than it is in the more agriculturally diverse, at some points declining regions of the upper South. And so during the period primarily between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, people can buy enslaved people in the upper South for a slightly lower price than that for which they can sell them in the lower South. And so, particularly as cotton becomes a more and more prominent crop in the United States, and especially after 1808, when Congress bans American participation in the Atlantic slave trade, there grows this robust business moving people from one region to the other, essentially moving them wherever their labor is most valuable.
Right. And so, we had the outbreak of the Civil War. And what impact did that have, as well as the creation of the Confederate government, the Confederate States of America, have on the domestic slave trade?
Well, it had a significant effect, but not in the ways that I would say that I expected to find when I started researching this project. I mean, you described them as facile assumptions, Tony, but I don't think they are. There's a certain logic to it, especially as people sitting in the year 2024 and able to look back knowing what happens in the Civil War. If you know what happens, it's completely logical to expect that people would not buy or sell enslaved people during the conflict, especially one that again, sitting where we do, is going to end in emancipation. But as is often, it's difficult but critical to remember that the people living in that moment didn't know what was going to happen. And so the Civil War does have numerous and enormously disruptive effects on the slave trade, but again, in slightly different ways than we might expect. So looking at secession, for example, the secession crisis, the withdrawal of the southern states following the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, inflicts great harm on the domestic slave trade, but not because white Southerners have great fears over the future of slavery, which is what I had sort of anticipated I would see in the sources. Instead, the real problem is actually one of economic breakdown. The sort of traditional exchange forms of exchange, the lines of credit on which the people who would buy enslaved people, those disappear. Sort of in uncertain financial and political times, people are unwilling to lend money or extend credit, and so the money basically dries up. It's not a question of confidence in the institution of slavery so much as it is just general uncertainty over whether or not one will get repaid. There are also and this is a problem that will persist throughout the Civil War, shortages of food and other goods. It had not been a particularly good harvest in the year 1860 outside of cotton, which did very well. And so there is uncertainty, but not what I expected to find when I started looking into this, which is to say uncertainty over slavery's future. Which had been, which is the driving force behind secession. White Southerners in the Deep South particularly withdraw from the Union because they're afraid of what Lincoln will mean for the future of slavery. But the establishment of the Confederate government is an effort to protect that future. And once it's established, there are large numbers of white Southerners who are very confident that slavery will persist.
Hmm. Very interesting. So how do these, the war starts and, we have several important battles. So how do these Union military advances and those emancipation policies that you mentioned, how do they affect the course of the slave trade in the Confederacy?
Well, they have a significant, but I would say uneven effect on the slave trade, which is to say, I'll flip those because I think it's important. Emancipation policies in the abstract have no effect whatsoever on the domestic slave trade, at least as practiced within the Confederacy. The story is slightly different in a place like Kentucky or Maryland, which remain in the Union, but where slavery remains legal. Um, in the Confederacy, however, they feel completely free to ignore the United States government's uh, emancipation policies and do. In fact, one of the things that struck me as I was reading through the sources is there when Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, for example, there is a flurry of articles in the Southern press pointing to the high prices that people are paying for enslaved people and saying they say repeatedly, often almost in exactly the same words, if this Emancipation Proclamation were going to matter, wouldn't we expect to see prices falling? Um, so in the abstract, these policies have almost no effect on the slave trade whatsoever. What matters, though, is the first part of your question. Where the Union military goes, they make those abstract policies real. Um, and even in many cases, the Army's effects far exceed the policies as written on paper. So essentially what I found is where the Union Army goes and stays, the slave trade withers up and dies. For the simple reason that Union soldiers, Union officers are unwilling to enforce the laws and the policies that had made it possible to treat a person as a piece of property. That they were not universally, but often, generally, I would say, unwilling to return people to slavery who had fled, unwilling to inflict punishments, unwilling to do sort of the dirty work enslavers required to keep slavery viable. It's not universal. There are places where Union soldiers do. There are places where officers eagerly return people to slavery. But the fact that they make it inconsistent makes it risky to acquire and hold people as property, basically. So where the Union Army goes and stays, the slave trade generally dries up and goes away as well.
Right, great. And as a follow-up, you have a great series of maps throughout the book which really illustrate this very clearly and very starkly that, once a city or an area is taken over and it used to have a slave market, that's closed and sort of the lines change and so forth
Mm-hmm.
about where this slave trade is occurring.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I'm glad you like the maps. A friend of mine from graduate school made them for me, and I think they look really nice. Uh, yeah. So what you do see, and I think is interesting, and a number of people comment on this during the war. You have a reorientation of the traditional direction of the slave market, and it's so, for example, New Orleans. New Orleans had been the largest slave market in the pre-war United States, and it's occupied fairly quickly, about a year into the war, by Union forces, and almost as soon as the Union forces arrive, the city's slave market drops off dramatically. There's still a handful of transactions. Slavery remains legal in New Orleans for much of the war, but again, it's risky enough that the future where the Union Army occupies is uncertain enough that those transactions cease. And so enslaved people are no longer moving from a place like Virginia, from a market like Richmond, which had been a major exporting center before the war, to New Orleans. Uh, Instead, what I find fascinating is at some level the market reorients itself less around economic profitability, less around immediate economic returns, and more around essentially places where people remain confident that the Confederacy is going to win. And so you have, for example, a soldier from Mississippi who actually I teach at the University of Mississippi, and he attended here just before the Civil War. His papers are in the library, 100 yards from where I'm sitting. He writes to his family and he says, you should sell people in Richmond. And he very clearly says the reason you should do this is because people are really confident we the Confederacy are going to win, in a place like Richmond, and thus the price offered for enslaved people is higher. There's a strong confidence. The war upsets the economy, and everyone sort of recognizes this. And so, what Confederates are looking to is, well, what do we think things are going to be like in the future, essentially?
Right, right. And that leads me to my next question, actually. You describe a very complex series of responses by Southern slaveholders to the collapsing economic conditions, all the inflation and so forth. You mentioned their confidence or wavering confidence in the future of the Confederacy and in the institution of slavery, fluctuating prices. All this sort of comes together and formulates complex responses. Can you make some generalizations about that?
Sure. I mean, generally speaking, and this is one of the things that I think surprised me as I was doing the research, is just how diverse the uses to which Confederates put the slave trade were, and the degree to which I think it helped support the bid for Confederate independence by mitigating the effects of the war. I think about it as Confederates sort of offloading some of the pressures they feel from the conflict onto the people they enslave, in many cases through the slave trade. And so generally speaking, one of the things that I argue is that the ability to buy and sell people helps Confederates cope with the hardships of the war. So, for example, parts of the Confederacy experienced pretty severe food shortages during the war, as particularly as the transportation system breaks down. Well, if slaveholders can't feed people, they will often sell them. And if they're running, or if they're short on cash to feed some of the people they enslave, they'll sell others for sort of ready money, in order to keep their larger operations afloat. Um, but it's not just that. The Civil War is huge, right? There's 31 million people in the United States and the Confederacy during the war, and their experiences are incredibly diverse. Many soldiers, for example, who leave wives and families behind to go fight in the Confederate Army, will try to secure enslaved laborers to help them shoulder the burden of operating a farm or a plantation, especially domestic work. You see, I was struck by the number of cooks and nurses and sort of domestic help being acquired during the war. Similarly, there's some really strange and like very specifically Civil War related circumstances that arise. One of the ones that stood out to me is, the Confederacy has a policy that if you, at least early on in their drafting process, if you can find a substitute, someone to take your place in the military, you are more than free to persuade that person however you can to take your place. And so I found a surprising number of Confederates who offer enslaved people to acquire a substitute. Um, and then which is just really, I mean, it's really striking. There's this moment in where a Virginian our artilleryman is desperate to offload an enslaved woman and her children to free himself from Confederate military service. And the only reason it doesn't work is that the enslaved woman dies while they're trying to sell her. The last thing, and I'll say this we talk about Confederate money is still sort of this shorthand for something that's not good. Uh, the inflation and the sheer valueness of Confederate currency is something that I had not expected to have a great bearing on the slave trade, but really did. Basically, Confederates hate to hold on to cash, and they want to put it into, I mean, for lack of a better word, an asset as quickly as they can. And not everyone chooses enslaved people as that asset, but a large number of Confederates do. Again, they operate on the assumption that when the war is over and when they win, the value of enslaved people will skyrocket, and so they see it as Confederate money is not going to be worth anything no matter what happens. They look at the example of the American Revolution and they say, one of the quotes that's lodged in my mind is revolutionary republics seldom pay off their obligations at par. So they know this money's not going to be worth anything. So put it in an asset that will, and enslaved people in altogether too many cases are that asset.
Right. A very complex story. So, with the end of the war, we had the collapse of slavery, the end of the domestic slave trade. But how does it represent sort of the tragedy and unfulfilled promise of Reconstruction? You have some really sort of morose and chilling stories, although some happy stories about sort of finding loved ones and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think it cuts both ways. Which is to say that in many ways, if the Civil War changed nothing, if I'm sorry, I should say if the Civil War changed nothing else, the removal of the threat of the domestic slave trade, the possibility of being bought and sold and taken away from loved ones, uh, that was one thing that it absolutely did accomplish. And enslaved people all throughout the South recognize this and celebrate this as a specific accomplishment of the war. And it's something you see in speeches, in rallies, and in all sorts of moments where enslaved people are celebrating the true accomplishments of the war. The sort of the flip side, though, is the fact that the slave trade no longer exists does not erase the decades of effects that it had. Effects that lasted, right up to and in a handful of cases after the guns fell silent. I was struck as I was doing this research, the number of transactions that took place in the week leading up to Appomattox, for example. And those people, if a person is sold right before Appomattox, it's in some cases not that different from if they'd been sold 20 or 30 years old earlier. They are just as gone. They are just as removed from a family. And when enslaved people defined freedom, when they looked at what the war was supposed to accomplish, what freedom really meant, one of the things that to which they aspired was wholeness in their families. And the wartime slave trade, it's not the only factor, but it's a major factor in denying them that. And so, uh, I remember reading a pension record where of that gives the account of a man, a member of the United States Colored Troops, a soldier in the United States uniform who had been captured and sold in the fall of 1864, and his family assumes that he is dead for the next 40 years. And the only reason they ever learn otherwise is that two different people file for pensions on his behalf, and the pension office notices this. So you have these really tragic moments that occur at the same time that this institution, or this part of the institution of slavery that had so long menaced people, it's gone, but its effects are still very much present.
Right. Interesting. So, coming back to our guiding question, in a nutshell, so how did the Civil War affect the domestic slave trade?
Well, I'd say dramatically. Obviously, it eventually destroys it. But in that intervening space, there's tremendous room for the slave trade and the people who are operating it to do an enormous amount of damage. While the war eventually destroys the slave trade, I argue in the book that the slave trade allows Confederates to fight on in many ways that they might not otherwise have been able to endure under the crises that the war creates, to exploit opportunities that they feel like it presented, and to put their money in some cases where their mouth is, to invest in the future that they were trying to build through the creation of an independent slaveholding republic. And so while you know in the end, right, the story gets where you expect it to at the beginning. At the end of the war, the war has destroyed the slave trade. But that space, those 4 years in between the beginning and the end of the war, are filled with a story that I think is much more complicated than we usually would consider it to be.
Right. Well, you've certainly proven that, Robert. I want to thank you very much for joining us. Congratulations on your important and fascinating new book, An Unholy Traffic.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking to you, Tony.
Great. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Check out the other interviews in our new American Civil War series on our channel. Thank you.